Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Shop Talk, hosted by the Triangle Area SQL Server Users Group. Tonight, full cast of characters. Directly to my right, as usual, we have Mala Mahadevan. Welcome in, Mala.
Hi.
How are
Good
you
evening,
doing?
everybody.
Directly below, we have Tom Norman.
Hello, everybody.
And indirectly below, or directly above, depending on your perspective, Tracy Baggiano.
Good evening.
So, Shop Talk, the way this works is this is 1 hour, question and answer style. Drop your questions in chat. Give us ideas of things to talk about, and you might be able to set me off on a rant. Those do happen from time to time. As we're going to start out tonight, our first topic comes from Tom. It will probably not set me off on a rant, so you guys will have to try a little bit harder than that. There's a good question in already. So, the Duke has a question we'll get to now. Yeah, let's just do it now. I said this is Q&A. We drop questions in chat. We do this live. We're doing it live, people. So while the Apple chip news is mostly Apple related, I think it would be cool to discuss what all this moving away from x86 and AMD 64 means to the database world, if it has any direct impact in its future. Anybody have thoughts?
That would be very interesting to have a chassis full of those little bitty chips and see if they would, the ARMs, and see how they would perform against a database.
Not that well, I don't think. So, okay. If you want like old man yells at cloud type of stuff, Itanium was the best that we were gonna get, and the fact that SQL Server doesn't support Itanium anymore, anything past 2008 R2, is a bit of a shame, because that was the best performance you were going to get for your CPU for heavy server activities. The x86, AMD 64, the Xeons, and other generations of CPUs, whether Intel or AMD, been pretty solid. Not as good as Itanium. And ARM is its own little interesting little animal, because it's really good for mobile devices and IoT. Small form factor, low heat generation, not necessarily dramatic processing power, but also not a slog. So, yeah, it is interesting. I don't think anybody's going to fill a cabinet full of ARM chips, like a server rack full of Raspberry Pis anytime soon. But you drop a bunch of these on tractors, on vehicles, anything else where you have an IoT scenario, and the idea of using Azure SQL Database Edge makes a lot of sense to me.
Well, it would be interesting to, how many parallel queries could I get on how many ARM servers or ARM chips?
Well, now we're at massive parallel processing with Raspberry Pis.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I think we've talked about this before. If I had the choice of hardware and I could choose what I want in hardware, I think the first thing again I want is RAM. The second thing I want is I/O speed. And the last thing I really want is CPU speed. So that's my choices. What about you guys?
I agree with those things. Same thing.
Kevin, we can't hear you. You're talking into the wind.
No, I was just mouthing the words.
Yes.
So it sounds pretty reasonable to me. Yes. I am for getting all of the RAM. I am for getting direct attached NVMe everywhere. And, if you're able to get really nice hard processing CPU, there are some cases where more CPU actually is the bottleneck, where you're an intensely CPU heavy workload. And yeah, in those cases, all right, let's go full bore CPU. But general purpose, I'd happily get more RAM first.
Well, the interesting thing that my specialty that I like to work with is encryption. And guess where encryption is? CPU. But the thing of it is now with Always Encrypted, they've actually moved a lot of that CPU processing over to your app server because it's all done through the .NET layer. So you're not needing it anymore on the SQL Server like you were prior to Always Encrypted.
Right. So Tracy, what are your thoughts?
I'm with you guys. We need RAM.
Seems legit. So the story that the Duke is mentioning is that Apple is switching over to its own CPU chips. They're going to be ARM based and will be in. So they already use a version of this in iPhones and iPads. They might make their way into iMacs and MacBooks. We'll see. I think that I could foresee that happening. You know, this wouldn't be the first time that Apple went out and made their own processors, or at least used their own processors. They've always had that interesting relationship with IBM PowerPC, but then they kind of went off and did their own thing for a little bit, and then came back to Intel later. If I remember right, an Apple fanboy in the audience can absolutely correct me on this because I'm not one. But that's my recollection. In laptops, we're seeing some ARM chips. You know, the low end Chromebooks tend to be in ARM. So like for those types of activities, yeah, I could see this. You're going to get much better battery life. That'll be the first thing you get. And not many people buy Macs to play video games, so you don't necessarily need extreme power. For video editing, photo editing, yeah, you're going to want a bit more than a low-end processor, but there are some pretty powerful ARMs. There's like the Snapdragon processors are pretty decent. They're not going to set the world on fire. You're not going to put them in a server room, but for small personal devices, yeah, sure. The question is, any thoughts as in a SQL Server Lite on ARM? Yeah, so that's Azure SQL Database Edge. And what this is, it's a SKU of SQL Server that's coming out. Ignore the Azure part. It doesn't actually run in the cloud. It runs on devices like a Raspberry Pi. It is in a public preview now, so you're able to get to it. And basically, it'll run on 64-bit ARM processors. And if I remember right, some x86 chips as well. But yeah, it's basically a fully featured version of SQL Server. It even has the stuff that you would expect in Standard and Enterprise Edition. So it's a lot better than SQL Server Compact or SQL Server Express Edition were, or are.
I know that last year at PASS, if you were one of the lucky ones sitting in the correct seat, you won a Raspberry Pi. So, and I actually got one of those. So I'm kind of waiting for that to come full bore, and maybe I might give it a test run on the Raspberry Pi.
Yeah, you can sign up for the public preview now. It was in private preview until I think April, but now it's public. So might be worth a try. I've got it on a Pi that's over this way. I can't go over and show it to you because it's all hooked in, but it runs, it behaves like SQL Server. It's a bit slower. You know, you don't have nearly as much RAM, and your CPU is not going to be pushed quite as hard. But for things like for IoT scenarios, it works really well. For low-end processing of what a database needs to do, yeah. And the idea of it being a competitor for SQLite, the short answer is yes, absolutely. The long answer is yes, absolutely, but there is licensing, and it's intended for IoT devices. So their licensing model explicitly is going to call out that, yeah, this is not, you don't buy a license of Azure SQL Database Edge and put it in your server rack.
It'd be interesting to see what type of model you would use basically to get the data out of that IoT device.
Right.
So
They push using Azure IoT hubs and IoT Edge. So that's a pattern that they've got they're working on. And the idea is that you're sending messages out to the devices can work. They can actually run machine learning models using Onyx, the open neural network exchange, so that they can generate predictions based off of the data they're getting. Going back to a vehicle scenario, based off of the temperature sensor that is in your tire, what is the likelihood that you're going to have a blowout or that you're going to need to replace the tires soon? So they can update the predictions based on those temperature readouts and tire pressure indicators and whatever else, and generate that prediction that, okay, maybe you should go get these tires swapped out now. So that's where its wheelhouse is intended to be. Not much pun intended. So yes, Mike, we were talking IoT. Glad you got in here. Although unfortunately, we may be switching over to another topic soon. What is the algorithm? That algorithm is something I just made up. But basically, it would be training a neural network using TensorFlow or PyTorch or Caffe or CNTK. And that'd just be something that I made up as an example of a scenario that you could use. That if I had a company that was dealing with transportation logistics, I could sell that. There are in vehicle device indicators for that kind of stuff now, so it wasn't exactly a stretch. I'm not coming up with a radical new idea. But that's not like part of SQL Server itself. That's just something you can do with it. So Tom has heard of TinyML. I have not heard of TinyML. I'm going to assume that it'll be like TensorFlow has their mobile version where it's intended to run on mobile devices. I would assume that TinyML would be something similar, and apparently it's something similar, which is cool. I like the idea. It's not going to help you, at least TensorFlow on the phone. That's not intended to train models, but generating predictions works well enough. FPGAs and UP, okay. So Tom has a question that he wanted to ask, and I asked him to hold it off until we got on the air.
So my question is, I'm looking at using partition tables, and long before partition tables were even part of the product, I wrote my own, and finished it right as the in-house was doing. So who has basically deployed it, and what type of performance is it going to help with? So if my main goal is basically to say, I've got a bunch of messages, literally thousands of messages going into a queue, and I want to partition them by month and get them off, because we're really only going to probably look at the last 30 to 90 days, and then but I need to keep it historical for legal purposes. Mm-hmm. So is that going to help my performance, hurt my performance, or be mediocre?
Okay. Who wants to give a take first? I'll give the second take.
So my experience with it is that it is not something that you play with if performance is what you're looking to gain. Yeah. It is very useful for archival reasons and for keeping your tables manageable size-wise and such. So I primarily used it as an archival tool, and I tried the situations for me where it didn't work at all, where I could not introduce the partitioning key into my queries. And if you're stuck with that kind of a situation, it is really, to me, it wasn't worth the gain in terms of the the time it took to archive whatever I wanted gone. That's my 2 cents on it.
I think it's completely fair, and in most cases, I absolutely agree.
Yep.
Partitioning can have performance benefits, but generally, the performance benefits are a secondary gain. One of the few exceptions that I've seen is in really large fact tables that have clustered column store indexes, because partition elimination can sometimes work for those. So, quick idea of what we're talking about here. Within SQL Server, you create a table, and in Enterprise Edition, I can create a partition on this. So I can split it out, essentially think of it as kind of like a bunch of tables internally managed and put together in one. So John Pham points out partitioned views. This is a bit different. Now, I haven't read the article, but a partitioned view is what Tom was talking about as the partitioning that he rolled himself. So you have a table for data from 2000, data from 2001, 2002, 2003, and all of those are in separate tables, and you create a view which union alls these tables together. And that can be better for performance than having everything in one giant table, because if you specifically look within certain years, you can focus down to a smaller total set of data. So with table partitioning, the concept is pretty similar. The implementation is not necessarily going to help performance for a couple of reasons. One is if you have a stored procedure that you're calling and you have an input parameter that it determines, like, if that's your date. Let's say you want to get everything from start date to end date. Well, unless you're recompiling that procedure every time, the optimizer is not going to know that, oh, this is the range that you want, so we only need to look at those partitions, the things that are in that date range. So it's going to have to look at the whole table because it doesn't have the ability to do partition elimination at that point. If you build your own query, like you write a dynamic SQL statement or you recompile, then you can get that benefit, and it can eliminate the partitions that are impossible to use here. The Duke mentions unless it's column store. Yeah, that is column store index partition. It's what I was talking about with fact tables, and that is good use case. That has its own rules with column store and the way it processes. But thinking row store, thinking about Tom's queue scenario, where it's not necessarily going to be column store index. If you want to store all of that data and you're specifically focusing on certain time frames, and you can recompile or use dynamic SQL, you might get a benefit depending on how many rows you have and what you're trying to do with the data. You can also take some advantage of parallel processing when you're doing joins. When you have a partition table, if you happen to use polybase at some point, you can use scale out with a partition table so that each of your scale out group members can hit a different partition and act on them independently. But generally, you're not going to gain much performance. What you will gain, like Mala said, is administrative ability. Like, I can take the data from prior months and move them over to an archive table as a metadata operation. So it's extremely fast.
That is a sad commentary then, because I wrote my own and was able to move through the tables very quickly and actually wrote queries to where I was very limited to what was mainly used, because you got data that okay, I'm going to use the first 90 days worth of data, but then the rest of it is I might query the other data every once in a while.
Yeah, the tricky part is that the optimizer has to know the values of those parameters.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a guarantee. Like, depending on how you write those queries, it's not guaranteed that the optimizer will be able to take advantage of that. So how big is the table that you're talking about? What's the scale that we're looking at?
You're probably looking at, maybe 100,000 rows a day going into it. So, yeah.
About
So
365K a year. How many years worth would you keep? 3, 5, 7, 20?
would need, because of the legal ramifications, probably at least 7 years.
Okay. Well, let's say 20.
Yeah.
So
So
365, 7 million or so rows. Not a tiny amount. If you're looking at ranges, I think you might be better served by using a separate archival table and keeping the hot data, the last 3 months or so, in your queue table and moving older stuff off into an archive table, or treating it like an event log and tracking it over time. But that's just because I have a thing for event logs.
yeah, when we did it before, we would actually, when we rolled over every month, we would basically just rename the tables and then start the next month up empty.
Yeah.
Start the next month. So we'd have like Prev 1 to Prev 17 or whatever it was, and just kind of just rolled them through, and it was really, really quick.
Right. In this case, what you'd have is basically current and history.
Yeah.
And each month you would take that prior current month and partition swap it over to history. So history gets larger. Both of those tables would be partitioned. And for the historical queries, if you recompile or use dynamic SQL, then you could take advantage of partition elimination. So some of those historical queries could get faster. Your current queries would definitely be faster because there's no way your current data, or whatever you define as reasonably current, could hit that old table.
Yeah. So the
But
fun
sadly,
part of partitioning.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out how to get speed and get rid of all that old data.
Yeah, and partitioning is, like Mala said, it's not a performance feature. It's more of an administration feature. The Duke mentions dealing with
Definitely sounds like it'd be good for archiving, though.
Yeah, it is good for archival. The Duke says, I deal with partitioned data all the time because gigantic data sets. Yeah, for that level, when you're talking about trillions of rows, it is a different story. And in those cases, you're trying to do whatever you can to pre-filter out as much of it as possible. And partitioning does a pretty good job of that if you consistently query along the lines of that partition. So this is where in partitioning, you now have to think about non-aligned indexes. Like if you have a queue table and you partition by date, but sometimes people want to say, well, which items did this person in the services team handle during whatever part of the processing? Well, that's not aligned by date. You don't care about date. I just want to know, what items did this person deal with ever? And
and that's going to look across the whole entire gamut of data set.
Yeah, so it's a non-aligned partition, and those can have their own issues.
Yep. Cool.
And Mala mentioned before we got started, Andrew Prusky has a video he did at Group By, and I have a link for the version he did at SQL Bits about partitioning. So let me drop that into chat, because I can do those sorts of things. And that way, anybody who's interested in getting into great detail on partitioning, check that out. Andrew's very smart. He knows more than just Docker. Knows plenty of other things.
You would also find good material on it on Kimberly's old blogs on the SQL Skills site. I may have to search for it, but she has some excellent material on it.
Yeah,
And I
Kimberly
think
Tripp.
she even has a talk on partitioning really large tables.
She does.
That would be, yeah.
Yep, that was at Past Summit in the last couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
So, all right, next we get into part of the night that I'm already anticipating chat's going to go wild. I'm looking forward to it because I want to hear chat's thoughts on this too. From Mala. So now you know who to blame. Go to statements in code. What the heck?
No, I was referring to, by that, I was specifically referring to T-SQL. So,
Go to statements in T-SQL. What the heck?
yeah, not in anything else. I know they have their usage in other languages, but in T-SQL, the specific scenario I saw, it was completely bad programming, in my opinion.
It's interesting because I actually had a developer that was working and writing a lot of T-SQL, and he was trying to very much make T-SQL object-oriented. And he would use these go-tos to, you might use it to like skip a section of code instead of doing an if statement or something like that. He would use a go-to to skip a whole section of code. So you can always tell a go-to that it's not a SQL developer doing it.
Mm-hmm.
As we see from anything related to SQL agents. It was clearly not developed by somebody who understood T-SQL.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever you generate that stuff, it's always like, go to this section, go to that section. And none of it was really necessary, but go to for error handling. Yeah, that's the Duke mentions a thing that I'm going to mention. So Mala saw this code. Solomon asks, was it my code?
No, no, not yours, Solomon. It was somebody else's. I won't mention the name.
So you're off the hook this time, Solomon, unless it was old enough that actually they just copied your code. You used it once, and then somebody else used it 500 times following up.
So this person apparently used that to get around writing begin end blocks.
Someone in this room? I don't think it was anybody in this room. No, I don't think it was even anybody in this chat room. But it's okay. We'll.
I haven't did that since 7th grade. Q basic, you had to write go-tos, and there was no error handling.
Yeah, let's get into that a little bit. So Edgar Dijkstra had this paper, and I'm gonna drop a link to the paper. He never liked the title, by the way. Go to considered harmful. He hated that title. Had a much less incendiary title, but basically made the argument that the frequency at which you use go-to statements in languages is approximately inversely proportional to your quality as a programmer. So, following up though, he did a couple years.
7th grader, and my quality was not good.
Well, there are absolutely factors involved in here. So Mike mentions go-to is just a jump, and yeah, and Dijkstra does follow up afterwards and say that, look, he's not terribly dogmatical about it, and that others are making a religion out of never use go-to ever, as if the conceptual problems of programming could be solved by a single trick, by a simple form of coding discipline. This was a few years later, and Donald Knuth had a response to Dijkstra's paper, and basically both of them essentially said, well, look, you're going to need the concept. The mechanics are where you get some of the fuzziness around this. So Mike's mentioning if you want to test at the top or bottom of a loop, you need an unconditional jump. And that is, in effect, a goto. And Dijkstra's original paper even says, hey, you use goto in low-level languages, in machine code, but in higher-level languages, you shouldn't need this. Twitch just buffered out. So I had a couple of frames drop, it looks like, but looks like I'm doing solid. I think it's permissible to use goto explicitly to troll people. I'll grant that.
I love that.
I'll grant that. But one thing to think about when all of this was happening, we're talking about the mid to late 1960s. The key languages of the time didn't have many of the things that we take for granted today. We didn't have break, continue, return, else, do, while, switch case. Yeah, else. If you had an if statement, I think it was Algol 60, you could have an if statement, but you can't have an else. In order to do the else branch, you actually needed a goto. You needed to jump to another section of code. So the concepts of structured programming came into place, essentially replacing everywhere that goto was used. In earlier days, when we are talking about those early 60s languages, goto was your key for how you moved through the code. And it does have its problems, where I can go up and down and like jump around in my code if I don't structure it well, and make it really difficult to understand what I'm actually doing. I'm calling it non-procedural movement because you're not following a step process. Instead, you're jumping around. Hopefully, you're mostly jumping down, but sometimes you got to jump back up. And that jumping makes it really difficult to understand for developers, which was Dijkstra's argument.
It wasn't just developers. If you're a QA person, if you have to QA code, it can drive you completely crazy.
Turns it into spaghetti code.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the argument. The spaghetti code. I'm bouncing around everywhere in here, and to follow what's actually happening can be really difficult.
You were mentioning a while ago about using it for error handling, and I would advocate that you should be using try-catch, instead.
You should with a but. Let me give the but.
Okay, give me the but.
Goto allows you to perform cleanup, regardless of whether you succeed or fail. This is what a finally block does in most procedural languages. So, in C# and Java, you have try, catch, finally. SQL Server, T-SQL doesn't have finally. So we don't have a guaranteed this is going to run no matter what section that helps us with deallocation and cleanup work. You don't necessarily need it that often in SQL Server. However, in languages where you do need to perform that cleanup or you may have memory leaks, that's the thing that replaces goto for error handling. Otherwise, you want to have that goto as unconditional exception handler. Yeah, that's exactly right. It's going to be there to clean up whatever processing has happened, regardless of how bad the exception was, regardless of how bad the world is falling apart around you. At least we're going to get to the finally block. And SQL Server doesn't have that. Not in T-SQL. So that's the only reason why I'd say you can have try-catch, and you should use try-catch as much as you can. However, there may still be a case for goto with SQL Server. Even though goto is strictly inferior to try-catch finally. And, it's not. We're not even talking about the exceptions. Like, even if you never get into the catch block, even if you never have the exception. So Mike mentions the problem with exception handling is it's a different use than exit codes. Yeah, this isn't even what I'm talking about with I'm going to throw an exception to force myself into a catch block. I think that type of development is not that great. You know, I'm a functional programming guy. I don't believe in exceptions. Code compiled. But the finally block, you know, that's going to run regardless of if you have an exception. So you don't have that overhead of generating and handling the exception, handling the stack trace. What you have is, after that try block succeeds, even if it's not an exception, you had some sort of error code. I tried reading from this thing. I got a message that looks weird. I'm not returning that as an exception. I'm just handling it as return an error. But you still have the finally block. You know, I still set my status. I can go through the finally block and then return my final result. And that's the thing that helps replace the use of goto. So why not do begin try, end try, begin catch, end catch? The same reason that I'm just talking about here. Absolutely use try and catch in SQL Server whenever you can. There are certain errors that do not get captured by try catch, and there's certain behavior within try catch that can be a little weird for T-SQL, but you know, understand that and still use try catch as much as you can. The tricky part here is, let's say that you're filling in some sort of table that is temporary but not really, and you want to make sure that you clear out any work that you did in that table when you're done with the procedure. I don't care if you had an exception. I don't care if it was the end of the world. We want to try to clear out that table. And if you put it at the end of a catch block, it's not necessarily going to be guaranteed that it will actually run that code. So where I've worked in the past, instead of goto, we execute a stored procedure that handles that. Yeah, it was still, the procedure call has to happen after. You either call it in both the try and the catch sections, or you call it after the catch in the hopes that it will actually get called. And it's not guaranteed that it'll be called. There are scenarios where the catch, especially if you rethrow an error so that your application can handle it, well, that stuff that happens after the catch block's not getting executed. That's the tricky part. I mean, even there, I'm not saying use goto for this stuff. In T-SQL, the number of cases where you really need to do that sort of handle cleanup is essentially nil. I had to come up with a weird scenario just to give an example. Like most of the time, oh, you created a temp table. Database engine takes care of that. You declared variables. Once they go out of scope, they get cleaned up. So the database engine handles most of the cases that we'd talk about classic programming languages needing to have a finally block, where we do memory allocation, object creation, opening up connections, and making sure that we cleanly close all of that stuff so we don't have memory leaks. Or where we don't have resource access issues later on down the road because you left that handle open, like you're still holding the semaphore, and the next call can't get in because you're still holding it. You never gave it up because the code's written in a way that, I don't know, I don't, it's written poorly. All right, I didn't want to say poorly. It's written poorly.
Thank you, Kev.
Now, there are a couple of exceptions. There are, even aside from this. And usually it's like cases where the word goto doesn't really mean goto. For example, in a switch block in C#, you can go to other cases inside your switch block. And you can use goto to break out of loops. If you're nested 5 deep in a loop, you can use goto to just cut through all of that stuff. Then the question becomes, why are you nested 5 deep in a loop? Is that really the right decision? And if the answer is absolutely yes, then goto can help. I would recommend there, move downward, don't move back up. Don't allow up. Solomon asks, how would goto even help in T-SQL in the sense of a finally block? I had to stretch to come up with my example, but basically think about, I want to create a permanent table. And I may do that because I'm using some feature that doesn't like temp tables. And I've actually had to deal with a couple of these. If I want to make sure that I delete my data, so my stored procedure inserts data into that permanent table that I'm having act as essentially a temp table. And I want to make absolutely sure that I get rid of any data I put in there by the end of the transaction. And this is a multi-phase operation. So I insert into this table, and I'm working with that data several times, and I'm going to delete the end results. I would want to use a finally block there to make sure that regardless if I catch an exception and I rethrow it, I'm still going to run that finally block and perform final cleanup. Or I want to make sure that my messages get written to a log, even if I capture them in a catch block. And I don't want to copy and paste the same message handling code in both try and catch, because that can change over time. The finally block encapsulates that regardless of whether you go through the try block successfully or you land in the catch block, you are eventually going to go through the finally block. That's where it could work in T-SQL. The number of cases where this would actually happen is extremely limited, like 1/10 of 1% perhaps. So it's not something that I'm going to go bug the developers about and say, you guys really got to get this in here. But there are some cases where it would work. It would help.
Fair enough.
And like Tracy mentioned with QBasic, if it's a language where GoTo is your tool for movement,
yes,
you can't.
Basic was that. Absolutely, yeah.
Yep. That was an example. There were different forms of Basic, going back to the 50s and 60s. That was process movement.
Well, Fox Pro too had some of that. When you had to do error handling in Fox Pro, you had to use GoTo. You didn't have a choice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this where, a try catch finally, the finally block really replaces most good cases of GoTo. If you have GoTo otherwise, there's a really good chance that it was not a good example of GoTo. But that said, I think it's also a fair point to remember that we don't have a GoTo problem today. Even the worst case that you can think of with GoTos, we have intense paranoia that, I have a GoTo, one. This isn't code from the Algol days where it was hundreds or thousands of GoTos in your code base. We're talking a couple. And so I just go back to Dijkstra and say, don't be too dogmatic about it. It's not generally a good thing, but if it is the best fit for something, just a word. Just don't code poorly. That's my best philosophy. Just don't code poorly. On that topic, go to Mala's book corner. What have we got for tonight?
I have two books, both technical this time. The first one is on SQL Server concurrency, locking, blocking, and row versioning by Kaylin Delaney. This is a little bit old, but it still is very relevant. And I love the Redgate books because they're so compact and easy to read. And if you ever have a reason to get a quick definition of something related to this, or maybe even you expect questions on it at an interview or anything, these are the best books to go to. And she covers all the different scenarios involved and in very simple, easy language to understand. So this is definitely a good book to keep in your SQL Server library.
Also, you can get the free PDF from Redgate.
Yes.
So just drop the link in there for that.
That too. Yeah. The second book is Joe Selko's Trees and Hierarchies in SQL. This again, it's not terribly old, but it is about 5 years old. It is an excellent book, and like all the books Joe writes, it is pure SQL. It is not SQL Server based or anything. But he does an excellent job going into concepts of trees, hierarchies, and graph data. He gives you the definitions of what each of them mean and the different ways, different kinds of data you can have. And he explains the three commonly used algorithms in navigating graph structures with examples. So, yep. So this is a great book to have as a reference for that. And his code can be used with a little bit of restructuring to suit T-SQL, but it's not all that much. I've used it, and it's totally worth it. I think he has a couple of pages on hierarchy ID and very T-SQL specific stuff here, but not a lot. Overall, I think it's an excellent book for understanding graph algorithms and how to code for that in SQL.
Yeah, this is definitely an advanced book. This is not the type of thing where I'm new to T-SQL and I just drop this on you. But if you do want to figure out how to model hierarchies, he gives the 3 common approaches and goes into a great amount of detail and does a really good job of explaining it.
Yes. So he does not cover the newest graph database implementation that SQL Server attempted a couple of versions ago. Just for anyone who wants to understand, this book was written before that. So that might be something to add to it if he writes another version as one other option, but it's not covered in this book.
Yeah. So those links I'll give you when I post the show notes for Shop Talk. And let's see, it looks like there haven't been any other questions. So let's talk about Azure ML. I've been going through a proof of concept with my team, going through Azure ML. And I got on the Azure ML train really early, 2017, if I remember right. It was, at that point, essentially billed as integration services for machine learning. Like, the demos emphasize that drag and drop nature of, well, we're going to build a logistic regression, so let's take a component that loads a data set. We're going to take a component that will let you clean a data set. And I'm going to double click on this and click my mouse 180 times to get all this stuff ready. And then if I want to do training of different models, oh, it's okay. I'll copy and paste those components and link them all together. And data scientists at that point complained and said, you know, I could do all this in like 6 lines of R or Python, right? So then later on, I got back to it. I kind of did a few presentations on it, shared some ideas. It was okay for people who were brand new to the idea. It was a good way of giving them some notion of, here's kind of the things you should start thinking about. But it wasn't going to fit well in most production scenarios. I actually did have one person who got a lot of success out of it because he was a .NET developer, didn't have much of an ML background, had a process that was already in place he could compare against, and was able to train an Azure ML model that essentially replicated the outputs of their old model that they had to take away, and gave them a pretty good result. So for that type of person, Azure ML worked. About a year or so later, I noticed that the later demos, they were still kind of drag and drop, except now you were dragging and dropping R and Python blocks. So it was, let's do the data cleanup. Drag this Python block in and copy this 6 lines of code, and that does your cleanup. Which was probably an improvement. Well, definitely an improvement. But at that point, the issue I had there was compute was expensive. Like, it didn't look like it was that expensive per API call. But when you start thinking about the number of API calls that big enough system makes per day, you start adding up the number of zeros and figuring out that you didn't miscount. So I left it alone for a while. I didn't think about it for a couple of years. And we came back to it this year. And now I think it actually looks a lot better. They've got integration with Azure Kubernetes Service and Azure Container Instances. So that piece, I think, works really well because now with ACI, the prices are pretty solid. You know, we can run off of like 24/7 the service that we're running. We can get it about a fifth of the price, moving from custom hosted EC2 instances over to ACI. Part of that involves some optimizations that admittedly we could do on the AWS side as well. So don't think of the prices that drastically different, but basically we can save a bit of money. We can also take advantage of that simplicity in deployment. I spent quite a bit of time customizing an AMI machine image for Amazon so that I could spin up custom built VMs that had all the software we needed and then go and pull this stuff down. Where with ACI, all right, I'm going to register a model as a container. Their model registration process is pretty easy, actually. It's not as good as MLflow for evaluation, but easier to manage, I think. MLflow, you have to configure it. You have to make sure that everything's set up correctly. Dealing with storage long term is more difficult because with Azure ML, it's essentially platform as a service. They also have this AutoML concept. You know, AutoML, I am not the biggest fan of AutoML, automated machine learning, because it is rarely going to give you a really good answer. However, I have grown to appreciate the right use of AutoML, which is to get 80% of a solution. Basically, very quickly to say, can we get something reasonable? Not, this is the final answer. But if I gave you an answer where this outcome looked like this, does that meet anywhere near the minimum? And then from there, we can optimize. The Duke respectfully disagrees. I would love to hear the disagreement. And while that's going on, Mike asks, how much non-recurrent engineering went into calculating the cost savings? So our current process, labor and engineering time, I haven't even factored that in. Basically, that was a sunk cost. At this point, it's essentially a service that's running versus a service that would be running. So all the time that I spent into building those AMIs, I spent into setting everything up all nicely. Yeah, that'd be lost, but I'm okay with that because we got to figure it out over on the other side. That's a one-time expenditure. I've seen AutoML replace multiple job responsibilities and perform nearly as well as a whole team with dedicated data scientists. Okay, I'll give you that. I have not, but that, you know, part of it could just be the scenarios that we're in. And if it does work for you, awesome. If it gives you a really good answer, that's great. It has not given me the best answers, but that said, it has given us pretty close to what we've been able to come up with as a team for the processes we've done. And I can get on board with that, especially as just what is possible. So I'm with you on, there are benefits in here, and I'm willing to be wrong on the scope of the benefits. I haven't seen them myself as clearly, but I'm willing to say, hey, there are a lot of scenarios in this world. Still, would I recommend Azure ML? Maybe. I'm a hard maybe at this point, which is better than where I was 2 years ago, which was a hard no. I think the pricing is much improved, especially if you go like ACI as your deployment model. I think that the interface has gotten better. A lot fewer clicks, a lot more in line with what other ML solutions are using. So it's worth at least investigating. If you're on Azure, you might be able to do you can do all of these pieces without Azure ML. You know, you can set up ML flow for evaluation, for model handling, model registration. You can use container services, launch your own VMs. You know, you can do all of the work without this. I think it does a pretty good job of tying it together. So Mike asks, my question is based on an aversion to vendor-specific development because there's always a reason each proprietary solution adds cost to their user community. I heard a lot of arguments to go for Azure, go to AWS, go to Google, even go to IBM. Well, at that point, you might as well go to Oracle Cloud. I'm gonna take a drink. So, yeah, you don't necessarily want to get yourself locked into one cloud, and I can understand the concern about potentially doing so. Yeah, no, I will agree with that. It's yeah, you do have to balance those benefits of taking advantage of platform as a service with the lock-in costs. I think that even in this case with Azure ML, you know, most of the models that we're building is it's still outside of Azure itself. You're still able to build those models using TensorFlow and Keras. You're still able to develop the code yourself. This is more of acting as model registry and deployment. So I could take those models and with a bit of manipulation, rebuild something that I could deploy to AWS. I know this because we went the other direction. We took those AWS models, were able to ship them into Azure after a couple days of dev work. So the Duke mentions, in most cases right now, it's about having the right consultation for AutoML. I think whatever you choose, make sure you can carry your environments over to the new system. Yes, on both fronts. Otherwise, it is a real hassle. Yeah, make sure that you can manage this and that you have a bug out plan. I agree. So in the last few minutes, I want to wrap up today with a quick question for everybody here. What is the dumbest thing you've heard someone say in your career? And I have a couple categories to give you an idea. The first one is the classic Dilbert strip. And the Dilbert strip basically is where the boss learned about the term SQL database. Is like, I want a SQL database. And it's a question of whether he actually understood it. So Dilbert asks, what color do you want that database? And the boss says, I think mauve has the most RAM. Does it count if I'm the one who said it? Those are even more fun. In fact, my example actually comes from me. I definitely said plenty of dumb things in my life. That's case one. Mauve has the most RAM. Case two. You know, the backups, they were just taking so much space, so we deleted them all. It was taking up too much space on our storage. We couldn't store it all. And the third scenario number 3, the where's the any key? This is where somebody walks in like, hi, I'm your new data scientist. What's a regression? I've never heard of that term before. So
I've got one for you.
Go for it, Tom.
Basically, we don't need encryption. We need performance. So I'm like going, okay, well, what does the government say you need?
If legal requirements say that you need performance or you need encryption, then yeah, you gotta.
And the interesting thing was this one was definitely storing Social Security numbers and PII data in its entirety. So
yeah, you need encryption.
Yeah.
I'm just gonna go out on that limb. You need encryption. Ala, do you have any?
I have two of my favorites. One of them is a boss asking me to turn off the transaction log. because it was taking too much space, and apparently, according to him, it just keeps logging everything that SQL Server does in case somebody wants to go and see what you did at 7 o'clock in the morning. So we don't need that, so go turn it off. So, so that was one. The second one was another customer where I was consulting who asked me to open a call with Microsoft because TempDB was not backing up.
TempDB was not backing up.
And that was also, a pretty funny situation.
Look, I created all my tables.
So he
and
had an agent job that would sweep through every database and back it up. And it failed on TempDB, and it failed, and it failed, and it's been failing literally for years. And this man is like, this is a bug that they need to fix. And he said, people at Microsoft, so you go and you talk to them. And it's like, it's not a bug. That is a feature. That's not a bug. And yeah, so those are my two.
Tracy.
I could give you so many, but I'm going to stick with just one.
Yeah, Tracy's going to write
a lot of terrible jobs. But I started a job, and as a training thing, they showed me how they changed procedures. So you go in there and you go into, this is old days, you go into Enterprise Manager and you write down everybody who's got the permissions or take a print screen of it and you print it out. Then you drop the procedure and you recreate it. So then I asked them if they heard of alter.
We don't really trust altering stuff.
Alter? What's alter?
I had never heard of it. And they've been doing this for like 3 years.
Wow.
This was their method. And doing it in production, literally dropping, creating, and then going back in and checking the boxes for permissions. They didn't know how to script it out. None of that stuff. I was like, can we just do alter instead? And he was like, what's that do?
That one definitely fits in the where's the any key category.
Yes.
Could tell you one where the manager asked me, how do you know a database is really corrupt? CheckDB says so. That was a middle of the night phone call. Took me all day to convince her it was corrupt and to get my backup so I could restore it.
How do you know that database is corrupt? Well, it's got a brand new car and spending a lot more money than it makes in a year.
The licensing is looking like a bribe.
The Duke mentions, I once saw someone execute delete from table in production. Yeah, that's always a good time where it's like, oh, this doesn't look right. Let me just start deleting stuff in production. Yeah, that's always a good scenario. So
I've had a headhunter sell me the line that you can run queries in production. I still don't know what to think of that. So I was told, in this job, you can run queries on production.
That was a selling point for the job, by the way. You can run queries here. Compared to some other jobs, it's not a bad thing. Hey, your developers can actually look at production.
I know.
And there are actually jobs where your developers aren't allowed to look at production. It does get more difficult. It becomes tricky to do your work. So it sounds stupid, but I kind of understand the sentiment. Mine.
Depending on your job, it may not be such an evil thing, but to sell it as a reason for somebody to apply for a job looks odd. That's all.
Yeah, that's not the greatest perk in the world. I agree.
Yeah.
Mine, Solomon, I think, is typing, so I'm interested in that one, especially because he's already admitted it's his. But mine also came from me. I was a developer at the time, web developer, and I was building a system that would handle some data. And one of the older crotchety developers asked, so what happens if the person enters the data incorrectly? And my answer was, then next time they'll learn how to do it right. Like, I'm not going to edit the data. You entered that. You pushed the button that said this is right. You verified it. Now, suck it up. That was really stupid. I ended up having to put in an edit button later. But at the time, I thought I was absolutely right. Afterwards, I realized, no, that's actually really dumb. So Solomon, I asked a high-level person in a company for a small system to test deployment timing, like when index rebuilds are required. The idea was to take a medium to large customer database and run the deploy on it prior to release and extrapolate the total set of customers, so the whole experience. This person said that the production SAN was too expensive to duplicate. I said, we don't need to duplicate the entire SAN. We can work with ratios. He said he wouldn't pay for it because it wouldn't be 100% duplicate of production, even though spending $1,000 to $5,000 would get us 90% of the way there, which would be close enough to get a fairly accurate estimate. That's something. That's something. Not a good thing, but it's something. Like, this is not a perfect example of exactly how production will look like, therefore it is completely unreasonable. Not perfect, it's useless. Yeah, that's where you might talk about statistical sampling. You know, it's the wrong answer for it, but at least it might blow enough smoke. Because if he's blowing smoke, let's blow smoke right back. How should or would I blow a whistle if I saw PPI or PII, personally identifiable information? That's gonna depend a lot on context. You have any thoughts, Tom?
Repeat that question. When should you blow a whistle?
If I ended up seeing a data set with PII, like, I guess somebody's, I don't know, I guess it depends. Is it?
You mean like the time that I was at a developer's desk and everybody's salary in my department was standing right there in front of me?
Could be that scenario.
And you needed help with something with this database?
Could be that.
You would definitely want to talk to the manager. Yeah, blow the whistle because they need to get that encrypted one way or the other.
In SQL Express, there's no encryption.
SQL Express, no encryption?
You can still encrypt it in the app.
Yes, you can.
Yeah.
Well, they were showing it to me in SSMS though, so, or they were troubleshooting something.
Yeah.
The developer shouldn't have been able to see that level of data, so just an example.
Mike
Yep,
says
they should not.
Report the loss of data up your chain of command, skip levels if someone circumvents. Yeah, that's fair. And the Duke mentions, hey, if you're doing analytics for the HR department, that data can be important. And yeah, it's sort of the context of it where when you're dealing with that kind of sensitive data, you know, like I've been in the healthcare space, and they will tell you lock your machine when you step away because you may have sensitive data there. I've seen people get fired from companies because they walked away from the desk with the machine unlocked because they have access to these systems that have the sensitive data. It's something that has to be taken seriously at a high enough level. So I agree with Tom and with folks in chat here that, you know, it depends on the scenario, depends on where you're at, what's the circumstances, and it may be as simple as, you know, if you're talking to a fellow developer, hey, probably shouldn't be showing that data to everybody because that is sensitive info. So, you know, keep that off the screen when you're presenting.
Or call me and I'll give you an obfuscation Windows functioning clause that will just obfuscate it in on a dev machine if that's where you found it.
Yeah, and if it feels like it's negligence or something really bad, that's where, yeah, do talk to management. If it's serious enough, may have to talk to a legal department. I'd hate to get into that tangle, but if it's something where that data is readily available to everybody in the company and nobody's doing anything about it, it is negligence. And that's one of the jobs of legal, is to prevent getting sued. So then it's up to them to determine, is this serious enough to take advantage? Or like, what do we do in response to this? How serious is it?
Well, and you now have, you know, CCPR, the new California law, and I'm sure that every single one of us have California people in our databases. that, you need to take this seriously. And so does your boss. And it's like, just mentioned to him that law. It went into effect earlier this year.
Yeah. Negligence caused by poor management. I mean, it may be something where talk to legal, you bounce it up a couple of levels.
But I need performance, Kevin. I don't want to encrypt. I need performance.
Makes sense. Okay, I'm going to finish up with Solomon's 2 stories, and then we really have to wrap it up for tonight. So, Solomon mentioned, I worked on a system where SQL Server was scheduled to reboot every Sunday night because that was a best practice. There was no maintenance window. Like, the system's down from midnight to 2, so customers did lose data sometimes. Just one story, but still, that's, yeah,
So funny story, me too. The first DBA job that I left and I moved on when I was walking out of the building, literally my last day on the job. And the guy who was supposed to take over after me, he wasn't a DBA, to be fair to him. He comes running behind me and said, hey, do I have to restart this thing anytime, you think? Or it'll just keep going on its own? I still think of that and laugh. He was scared of the idea that someday it might have to be restarted.
Yeah. No, every Tuesday, they call it Patch Tuesday. You have to reboot the machine. Microsoft requires it. It's like legal. All right, with that, we are going to wrap up for tonight. Thanks, everybody in chat. Thank you for anybody watching this after the fact. If you want to, email us at shoptalk@tripass.org with your questions, or drop them here in chat. Thanks again. We'll see you all next week. Have a great week.
Goodbye.
Good night, everyone.
Right.